the forgotten struggle. In 1599, a council was called on the shores of Kerala, not by the people, not by the ancient Christians of India, but by Rome, the Synod of Diamper, a moment when European priests sought to bend India's oldest church to the will of a foreign throne. They came with crosses in one hand and decrees in the other, demanding obedience, erasing traditions, burning books, silencing voices that had prayed in this land for centuries. But India was not silent. The faithful remembered their heritage, and from this clash was born one of the most decisive rejections of Rome's authority in Asia. This is the story of power, resistance, and the struggle to define faith on Indian soil. The Synod of Diamper sought to erase a history. The Coonan Cross Oath fought to reclaim it. In those 60 years, the St. Thomas Christians of India learned the price of submission and the cost of rebellion. In the heart of Kerala, on the Malabar coast of India, two events stand like shadows over history: the Synod of Diamper in 1599 and the Coonan Cross Oath in 1653. One was the attempt of the Portuguese Catholic Church to crush the ancient faith of the St. Thomas Christians, forcing them under Rome's authority. The other was an uprising, a cry of defiance, when thousands swore before the cross never again to bow to foreign domination. This was more than religion. It was culture, language, identity, a struggle between colonial power and native faith. The Synod of Diamper burned books, erased traditions, and chained a people to Rome. The Coonan Cross Oath broke those chains with trembling hands and angry voices, declaring, "We will not be slaves to your altar." This is not just the story of faith, it is the story of resistance, the forgotten struggle of a people who dared to defy empire in the name of God and in the name of freedom. Imagine a Christian community that has stood the test of centuries, not in Rome, not in Europe, not under the shadow of emperors or the decrees of popes, but on the coast of India, where the Arabian Sea meets the Malabar shore. This community traced its origin not to missionaries sent by Rome, but to one of the apostles himself, Thomas, the doubter who touched the wounds of Jesus and then carried the message eastward. For nearly 2 millennia, these Christians, called the Nazranis, or followers of Jesus of Nazareth, preserved a faith independent of Rome. They prayed in Syriac, the ancient liturgical language of Mesopotamia. Their bishops came from Persia, not from Europe. Their rituals blended seamlessly with Indian traditions. Their faith was not an imported garment, but a living root deep in Indian soil. For centuries, they lived in dignity. Hindu rulers granted them copperplate charters, confirming their rights and privileges. They were traders, scholars, and respected members of society. Unlike the constant struggles between church and crown in Europe, these Indian Christians coexisted peacefully within the wider culture. They were not Catholic, they were not Orthodox, they were simply Nazranis, Indian Christians with an identity as old as, and in some ways older than, Rome itself. But in 1498, sails appeared on the horizon. Vasco da Gama's fleet arrived, carrying not only merchants, but also a mission of conquest. With the Portuguese crown came the Vatican. With the sword came the cross. Rome, struggling to maintain its authority in a fractured Europe, turned its eyes outward. If Europe was slipping from its grasp because of the Reformation, then perhaps Asia, Africa, and the Americas could become new trophies of papal power. The Nasranis welcomed the Portuguese at first. They were not hostile to other Christians, but they soon realized this was not a meeting of equals. This was domination disguised as fellowship. The Synod of Diamper, 1599. In the small village of Udayamperor, known as Diamper, Archbishop Aleixo de Menezes of Goa summoned the St. Thomas Christians to a council. It was called a synod, but it was not dialogue. It was conquest dressed in religious robes. At Diamper, their sacred books written in Syriac were confiscated and burned. Manuscripts that carried prayers, hymns, and theological reflections older than the papacy itself turned to ash in the flames. Their ancient liturgy was rewritten. Their bishops, once chosen from Persia, were replaced with Latin prelates. Local customs, which blended Indian culture with Christian faith, were condemned as heresy. At the end, one demand remained: submit to Rome. This was not a reform, it was erasure. 1,000 years of independent Christian identity was forced into the mold of European Catholicism, but memory cannot be burned as easily as books. Life under Rome's grip. For 50 years after Diamper, the Nasranis outwardly submitted. Their liturgy was policed. Their leaders were appointed by foreigners. Their customs were mocked. They were told that their heritage was backward, their language unfit for prayer, their faith incomplete without papal control. And yet in their homes, parents whispered to their children, "This is not the faith of our ancestors." They remembered. They waited. They endured. The Coonan Cross Oath, 1653. The breaking point came in 1653. In the town of Mattancherry, thousands gathered before a great stone cross, the Coonan Curishu. They tied ropes around the cross so that even those standing far away could hold on. With one voice, they swore an oath: "Never again, Rome. Never again will we submit to foreign domination." The cross is said to have bent under the strain of thousands pulling together. It became known as the Bent Cross. This oath was more than a protest. It was an act of liberation. It declared to the world that Indian Christians would no longer accept erasure. The Portuguese were shocked. Rome was humiliated. For the first time, an entire Christian community collectively rejected papal authority. The aftermath: division and survival. The Coonan Cross Oath created a permanent fracture. Some communities returned to communion with Rome, becoming what is today the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church. Others remained independent, aligning with the Syriac Orthodox tradition, forming the Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, the Jacobite Syrian Church, and later the Mar Thoma Church. Unity was broken, but dignity was reclaimed. The Nasranis had shown the world that even under empire, even under coercion, identity can survive. The larger lesson: the Synod of Diamper and the Coonan Cross Oath were not merely events in Kerala's history. They are part of a larger story of how religion has been used as a tool of empire. Rome's intervention was not about theology, it was about control. Burning Syriac manuscripts was not divine inspiration, it was an attempt to erase memory. Declaring Indian customs sinful was not about holiness, it was cultural arrogance, and the Coonan Cross Oath was not simply a rebellion. It was a reminder that communities will resist when their history and faith are threatened. Legacy today. The legacy of this struggle lives on. Kerala remains home to one of the most diverse Christian landscapes in the world. Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, divided, yet still carrying the marks of that forgotten struggle. The bent cross at Mattancherry still stands, a silent monument to resistance. And the question echoes through history. If the biblical God truly desired one faith, one truth, one church, why did Rome burn books, erase traditions, and demand submission at gunpoint? Was it the will of God, or was it the will of empire, using religion as its mask? Closing reflection. The Synod of Diamper is a story of erasure. The Coonan Cross Oath is a story of defiance. Together, they reveal a truth that history often hides. Faith can be twisted into a tool of control, but identity rooted in memory can outlive empire. The Nasranis of Kerala remind us that when faith is enslaved, resistance is sacred, and that the struggle for dignity, though forgotten by many, still speaks powerfully to our world today. In those 60 years, the St. Thomas Christians of India learned the price of submission and the cost of rebellion. Their story is not just about Christianity in India. It is about power, colonialism, and the way religion became a weapon of conquest. But it is also about defiance. For when thousands held that rope tied to the cross and swore their oath, they declared something eternal. Faith must never be enslaved. The empires have fallen, the altars have shifted, but the struggle remains alive in memory. The Synod of Diamper and the Coonan Cross Oath are not relics of the past. They are warnings for the present. Because wherever power dresses itself in religion, and wherever conquest hides behind a cross, humanity must choose submission or resistance. The Coonan Cross Oath ultimately produced division. Those who remained aligned with Rome evolved into what is today the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church. Those who resisted pursued ties with the Syriac Orthodox tradition, forming the Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, and later other branches such as the Jacobite Syrian Church and the Mar Thoma Church. Unity was fractured. Rome's aspiration of absolute control was broken, the symbol of resistance. Today, the Kunan Kurishu stands as a monument to that resistance. It is less a relic of division than a sign that, when faced with cultural erasure, communities will act to preserve identity. Legacy and lessons. The Synod of Diamper and the Kunan Cross Oath are not isolated historical episodes. Their consequences remain visible in Kerala's religious landscape. The divided legacy. The Christian community that once shared a common identity is now expressed in several ecclesial bodies. The Syro-Malabar Catholic Church, in communion with Rome, tracing continuity from those who accepted papal jurisdiction. The Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, the Jacobite Syrian Church, the Mar Thoma Church, and related bodies, tracing their identity to those who resisted. A 1,000-year unity was permanently altered within a century of Roman intervention. This division arose not only from theological differences but from the collision of empire with indigenous religious life. The larger lesson. The Synod of Diamper teaches a broader principle. When faith becomes intertwined with imperial control, it can cease to serve as a liberating force and instead function as an instrument of domination. When external authorities burned Syriac manuscripts, this was not an act of divine mandate, but of institutional consolidation. When Portuguese clergy dismissed Indian customs, the action reflected cultural arrogance rather than spiritual care. The Kunan Cross Oath exemplifies a different truth. Communities can and will resist when their identity and memory are threatened. The oath was an act of dignity as much as dissent. Faith versus control. History shows repeated patterns of religion serving imperial aims. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, colonial powers combined military force with missionary activity. Land was conquered, and souls were targeted as instruments of governance. Yet the people's response matters. The Kunan Cross Oath is a reminder that faith, when tethered to local life and memory, can be reclaimed from colonial frameworks. The echo today. The bent cross at Mattancherry remains a visible reminder that identity resists erasure. The lessons extend beyond Kerala. They speak to how we approach cultural contact, conversion, and religious authority worldwide. For the Nasranis, the struggle was not only theological, it was existential, the refusal to let outsiders define who they were. And so the central question remains, if the biblical God truly desired one faith, one truth, one church, why has history been marked by forced conversions, book burnings, and mass acts of resistance? Was it God's will, or was it the will of empires using religion to secure power? Closing reflection. The Synod of Diamper is a story of erasure. The Kunan Cross Oath is a story of defiance. Taken together, they leave us with a clear lesson. Faith must not be enslaved. Identity, when threatened, can rise again, even under the weight of empire.